Hello, my name is Shannon Gilmore. In the last video, I shared with you how our emotions can be quantified by frequency and vibration. This has been a lot of scientific insight so far, and I'm going slow on purpose. In this video, I just want to back things up a little bit and take them back to the place where we can all relate to, the Bible. I feel it is important for us to go slow and progress appropriately while keeping God in the details. I want us to go back in time just for a bit to help us to retain the beauty and awe that makes God who He is. Our faith depends on Him, and I don't want to make science into anything more meaningful than our Creator. I believe science is the conduit that God uses to show us who He is in a way that we can understand, and I want to remain respectful to what God has shown me and what He has already shown you. So please join me in this video as I'd like to share with you through the underpinnings of Scripture just how and why the enemy has hijacked kingdom power as we see that this is all around us. The supernatural spell castings and fanciful tales of Hollyweird shows us the enemy's foothold that lingers right in front of our noses, and we're not even aware of it. But this is nothing new. But the enemy wants us to believe that they are the makers of everything. So let this video put the enemy in his rightful place. Sit down and be quiet. Let God be true, and let's allow His word to shine His truth. We live in a time where the truth has been hidden from us, that is certain. And we have been kept from the truth as the truth has been guarded against us for a time. It seems that the guardian of this truth has been using science and to redirect our attention. However, it also appears that science of modern day is just now able to reveal to us what she has always wanted to say, but couldn't: God's honest truth. How can that be? Haven't our textbooks and teachers and leaders in the academic world always led us to the truth? I mean, those of us who decide to become medical practitioners and scientists and leaders of tomorrow lead the truth, need the truth today, and lead with the truth today, right? Oh, let's not get too hasty here, because most of our teachers are just teaching what they have learned and what they've been told to teach. Most of what we have been taught in schools is actually a regurgitation of the same thing of yesteryear. However, God has allowed some brilliant minds who follow Him to get up there and stand up for the truth for His sake. This is what we are seeing with the branches of this is what we are seeing within the branches of science today. It can no longer be hidden because one branch of science doesn't stand on its own like it once was thought that it could or should. One branch of science actually enhances another branch of science, while those two branches of science enhance another branch of science, and those three branches of science enhance another branch of science, and so on and so on and so forth. Scientists who seemingly have nothing to do with another scientist within a different field of scientific study, well, they're starting to talk. Awesome! When they begin to talk, the science gets moving in the right direction that stands up for truth. Thank you, everyone. I love science. How do we ever get to a place in time where we need the truth exposed to us? Well, that's where the Bible can fill in the gaps. I love the Bible too. The truth wasn't necessarily stolen from us, but instead our ancient brethren were coerced into giving what was precious and godly away unknowingly. It was manipulated away from them, and it's manipulated away from us in a way that has led to our becoming ignorant today of the truth, as the truth has slowly and silently been taken away and hidden. What was freely given away unknowingly, as covertly manipulated and used against us by the Egyptians of long ago, then the Assyrians and the Persians and the Babylonians and the Romans, and this is all depicted through the Jerusalem dispersal when King Nebuchadnezzar came in. There were actually kingdoms that came in before King Nebuchadnezzar that sacked Jerusalem and dispersed Jerusalem all over. That's a very interesting study because it starts with that. It's a really interesting study because that dispersal started with King Solomon, and it was after his death that Jerusalem was split in two. I don't want to get too ahead of myself here, so let me take this study to a time of Jesus's ministry. It is believed by some people that Jesus went into India, Tibet, China, and other Eastern regions to learn about the ancient mystics. Really? Let me get this straight. God, who is all-knowing and all-seeing, needed to learn about ancient principles and spiritual rituals that had nothing to do with the Hebrew God? Really? I don't think so. Don't believe that hype. Don't believe that. Because I'm going to call bullshit on that one. If Jesus did that, this would mean that Jesus served other gods. God cannot blaspheme him. God cannot blaspheme himself. Jesus cannot blaspheme his holy and perfect name. To do so would invalidate his message and the reason for taking on flesh in the first place. He would have invalidated himself, to which he cannot do. To learn from other gods would invalidate the words that Jesus said to the enemy when Jesus was confronted by the enemy. This said, love the Lord your God and serve him only. To learn from other mystics would imply that Jesus himself believed that he was not the one and the only one who stood for truth. To learn from other mystics would mean that Jesus is not the only way, the truth, and the life. To learn from other mystics, Jesus would have to acknowledge other prophets that come after him, using someone else's name other than the Father in heaven's name. To learn from mystics, Jesus would nullify the Father, himself, and all of creation. So please do not believe that Jesus was taught by any other person. So please do not believe that Jesus was taught by anyone other than God himself, as the Bible tells us this. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth, and the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Luke chapter 2, verses 39 through 40. The Bible does not suggest or teach that Jesus went anywhere else other than Jerusalem and its surrounding towns and cities. When you look at the teachings of Jesus, you will notice that his territory encompassed the 12 territories that the 12 tribes of Israel, who are mentioned in the Old Testament, inhabited. It is often believed that Jesus went into the eastern places to teach or to learn, and no one can know for certain, as it is possible he did go there to teach, but I personally do not think so. Again, when you look into the ministry of Jesus, as far as our Bibles will show us, we are shown that he went from town to town, and people followed him. They left their families and their jobs to hear his message. Even the Canaanite woman who was bleeding for 12 years, she reached out to Jesus. Even the Roman centurion who went to Jesus because his slave was paralyzed, he went and asked Jesus to help. This gives truth to what is said: when we seek Jesus, we will find him. And here's another detail to that mandate. The parents of Jesus went back and searched 3 days for Jesus, and they found him in the synagogue. And as Mary, his mother, chastised him, Jesus said, "Where else would I be? Didn't you know I'd be found in my Father's house?" Wow, that is interesting coming from a preteen. Wow, this is a physical message, as this is obvious, but the spiritual, hidden, unseen message is this, that the Lord's house is in heaven. However, those who follow Jesus, he can be found in them. And how we find Jesus is through opening up the Word, reading it, taking it in, eating of it, digesting it, and acting and speaking it out. And this is what it means when Jesus says, "If I remain in you and you remain in me, whatever you ask for, you shall receive." So how did it appear that some of biblical teachings can be found or hinted or alluded to through the adoption of other cultures? How is it that other Eastern regions and religions teach a form of charity and benevolence that emulates the teachings of Jesus? Okay, not verbatim, but the teachings are still marked in his humility. And that's a question I'd like to address in this video, as I believe understanding this will help with scientific applications stated in previous videos and future videos. Understanding the reasons behind the question of how other religions seem to mirror or allude to Christianity in some way will serve to enhance the scientific aspect that will draw your heart closer to the heart of God. In this video, I'd like to share with you how the enemy has hijacked kingdom power and has used it against us, using supernatural powers and leading us to believe in the hype that it is the power of the enemy. This belief serves to keep us bound in fear, uneducated, and unwilling to learn. It causes stagnancy. When we live in a state of shock and awe, not wanting anything to do with the supernatural, "Ooh, stay away from me," we are then subdued, and the enemy can live a life without us ever becoming a threat. Did you know that the ancient Hebrews, who are our ancient ancestors, were first influenced by the Egyptians? They were influenced by other Semitic regions before this, but the major influence was from Upper Egypt. I stumbled on this little breadcrumb in my own personal Bible study years ago, and I found myself looking deep into the story of Moses. He was a man called to deliver Israel from the hands of Egypt. Why? Because he had a working knowledge and understanding of the Egyptian magical arts, the same arts that bound Israel in their heart and mind to Egypt, even though they wanted freedom from Egyptian slavery. The Israelites knew they were in physical bondage, but had no idea that their mind and their heart was also in bondage. They had no idea because of their spiritual enslavement in their hearts and minds, and that led them to being subjugated physically. Where did this understanding that Moses had come from? Well, God placed Moses in direct communication with Egypt's king because Moses was given access to the Pharaoh by the way of adoption. Moses was raised as one of Pharaoh's own. God infiltrated the enemy's camp with one of God's own, and the enemy couldn't even see it. God does this time and time and time again, even with you and the situations you find yourself in. The best example we have to date is through the ministry of Jesus, because Jesus himself was also born into the enemy's territory and used the enemy's secrets and false teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees against the Hebrew false council and exposed them for the liars that they were. Using truth to expose the lies, exposed the enemy to those who desperately wanted to follow Jesus. Today, God is exposing the lies of science, or the lies of those who have used science to serve their own gain. God has infiltrated the scientific world and placed men and women inside the enemy's territory to expose the science for what it truthfully is. It is a means to show us who God is in a way that we can physically understand. People such as Greg Braden, Bruce Lipton, Dr. Joe Dispenza, and others, James Tour, we have no excuse to assume that God has abandoned us and left us to survive on our own. The science of today is revealing the thumbprint of God in all of creation, and it turns out that the heartbeat of what we once called science is now only a hiccup in this thing we call life. Thank you to the scientific community. Your efforts are greatly appreciated. Turning to the pages of the Bible shows us that Moses was a man who did not need science to validate to him what he was born into. He knew what he knew and knew it very well because he was scientifically trained by the Egyptian magical arts. It's called Kemetic science. Moses was well educated, and he knew the hidden secrets of creation that his Egyptian upbringing forced upon him. He had no choice but to learn of the secret things of the under and nether worlds. But how did he become the man to lead the Israelites to freedom? Or better yet, how did the Israelites get to a point in their lives where they needed freedom? How did this group of godly people ever find themselves under the subjugation of Egyptian rule? Well, it wasn't always this way. And had events of previous times not have happened, Moses would never have been needed. It turns out that generations before Moses was even born, the Israelites were living very comfortably within Egypt's borders. How they came to live in peace with Egypt was through one man named Joseph. He was the youngest son of Jacob, who had 11 other sons. When Joseph was in his teens, his other brothers conspired against him to leave him for dead. But Joseph didn't die, but instead was sold into slavery. He found himself in Egypt, and because of his faith in God and his ways of integrity, he found favor with the Pharaoh. Why would Joseph's brothers try to murder their younger brother? They weren't of evil, were they? This sounds very evil in nature, and it is. How? What was going on? I'll get to that reason in just a bit. But for now, it is important to understand that because Joseph, as a man, found favor with the Pharaoh, the tribes of Israel were allowed to live with Joseph in the land of Egypt for a time. It wasn't until Joseph's death the tribes of Israel would have to pay for the sins of their fathers, and they would be sold into slavery and subjugated. Their punishment would be worse than what Joseph received, all because the 11 sons failed to repent and let it be known of the ill deed of what they had done to their brother and repent of that with their father and before God. They kept the secret and they went to their graves with it. Holding fast to that deception, they deceived Jacob, they deceived their children, they deceived God, our Father in heaven. So please take notice, as this is a sideline note. This is what we do when we hold fast to our sin and do not confess them before God and make amends to never participate in those sins again. The 11 sons didn't just sin against their younger brother. They sinned against Jacob too, as they lied to their father and led Jacob to believe that the younger brother was killed by an animal, which caused Jacob to sin against animals and cause their innocent bloodshed. And this is the point Jesus' ministry is trying to make, is that when you commit sin, you are committing not just adultery, not just breaking your vow, you are eventually committing murder, because you are committing sins not just against yourself, but against the person that you're sinning against and the people that are involved in that. And you're sinning against God. How can God bless you if you sin against others? How can God bless you when you're neck deep in your sin and you can't see you're sinning? How can God bless you and grant you the desires of your heart when the desires of your heart are gravitating to your sin and sinning and harming others? Sin harms not only you, but it harms other people. And this is the story of through Joseph and his being sold into slavery is meant to show us. So when the older brothers were reunited to Joseph once again, Joseph did not tell Jacob what his brothers had done to him. Joseph couldn't break his father's heart again. This would cause him to form bitterness and hate towards his sons. Joseph did not repay evil with evil, instead forgave and let God intervene, to which God did. Israel would pay for the wrongs committed on the family, and Joseph would be blessed. The son of the father, the wrongs committed on the family were also committed on the son and the father by becoming slaves to an Egypt that Israel had never known. So this poses an interesting question. Why was the Pharaoh in Joseph's day so tolerant towards Israel, the 11 tribes of Jacob? Was it that Joseph had so much clout? The Bible does share with us that Joseph was trusted by Pharaoh, but giving this much deeper thought, why did the Pharaoh not object to thousands and thousands upon thousands of people coming into Egyptian land during a time of famine, when these people needed to be fed? Not only that, but they needed pasture land for their animals to live off of. It is my belief that one of the reasons why the Pharaoh did not protest was perhaps because of a history that may have been passed down through oral tradition. Maybe it was recorded in the history books. We don't know. However the truth was told, the Word of God shares with us the truth about Abraham fathering a child with an Egyptian handmaiden named Hagar, generations before Jacob moved his family into Egyptian territory. During the time of a great famine, Abraham or Abram went with his wife Sarah or Sarai into Egypt. Because Abraham had not known the Pharaoh, he told his wife to pretend that she was Abraham's sister. Now this was a lie, but it was to protect, as this would prevent the slaughter of Abraham and all the clansmen, and it would protect Sarah herself, as she may be taken into captivity against her will if Abraham was murdered. God intervened and softened the Pharaoh's heart and revealed to the Pharaoh who Sarah was. Pharaoh sent the couple away unharmed. Now, this is possibly how Sarah received a handmaiden. Hagar was most likely given to Sarah as a gift from the Pharaoh when the couple left Egypt. Hagar went to live with them. Now, because Sarah was unable to conceive a child, she convinced her husband to lay with Hagar and conceive a child with her. The child Hagar bore for Abraham was the firstborn, but he was born outside of the Hebrew promise because Hagar was not considered a Hebrewess. She did not convert to the Hebrew ways. This child, although had legal right to Abraham's inheritance, because of his Egyptian mother, Sarah knew that if her husband Abraham died, Hagar and her son Ishmael would lead Abraham's clan. Sarah saw how Abraham favored his firstborn son over those in his clan who were spiritually in alignment with Abraham. Abraham loved Ishmael because he was flesh of Abraham's flesh, not because he was from Abraham's bosom or heart, like Abraham's clansmen were spiritually brothers and sisters and sons and daughters to Abraham. Upon Abraham's death, Ishmael and Hagar, two Egyptians at heart, would gain Israel's inheritance. It was Ishmael's birthright after all, but Sarah knew that an outsider would destroy the leadership and affluence of Israel. Sarah knew that Ishmael would potentially squander all of Israel's riches and make slaves of Israel's people. Her heart hardened against Hagar and Ishmael for good reason. When Hagar and Ishmael were sent away at the urging of Abraham, God had favor on them. But where did they go? Well, Hagar most likely went back to her homeland in Egypt. This woman most likely didn't just mingle in with the common folk and settle in nicely with the townspeople. Because she was an Egyptian handmaiden, she would have went back to the Pharaoh and the courts to petition her and her son to stay in the Egyptian royal community. The education of godly wisdom and practice she would have witnessed in Abraham's camp, and Ishmael would have been reared up on this. She and Ishmael would have taken this and given some of this insight to the Pharaoh, mixing in nicely with Egyptian deity worship. Do you not think that Ishmael was a little bit bitter as he was turned away from his inheritance, not knowing the real reason why? Do you not think that this little boy grew up with that hate in his heart and made vows out of bitterness for his half-brothers and sisters? It is possible. Maybe the Pharaoh that enslaved Egypt after Joseph died was a sympathizer towards Ishmael. I'm just saying, I'm just putting it out there. This is nothing new. And turning back to the story of Joseph and his brothers shows us that he too was a lost son of the tribe of Israel and turned away, not by his father, but by his brothers. His half-brothers turned Joseph into a slave. Even though the tribe of Israel through Jacob would be born of the same family, they didn't have Egyptian and split Canaanite roots. They all came from the same Hebraic family. The 12 brothers would not have the same mother, however, and that caused division because Jacob loved one mother over the other mother. Sarah was someone that Abraham loved. Hagar was unloved by Abraham, but even though she was unloved, she was still treated respectfully. Jacob, too, was devoted to one woman, but also obligated to the other. The children born of Rachel, the woman Jacob loved, would have his favor, and those children would have Jacob's favor. But the children born of Leah, they would be left less cared for. The youngest son Joseph was born to Rachel, who would be the most favored, and this turned the remaining brothers into jealousy. Even though these unloved or loved less children were of the same bloodline, the motives of their hearts turned against their heritage. Through their hate or lack of love, and because of their feelings of rejection, they unknowingly emancipated themselves from the inheritance that they had. These brothers made the conscious choice when they were young, in more ways than one, to separate their hearts from their inheritance. These brothers turned to the Canaanite way of life, as they may have found peace and acceptance within the many deities of pagan worship. The brothers did things in secret, all in attempts to help them feel better, perhaps. They were rebellious because they felt unloved. The brothers were spied on by their little brother Joseph, as he always found out what his big bros were up to. And this is one of the reasons why they wanted to get rid of Joseph. What a little tattletale. Jacob, the father, was not blind to what his sons were doing. Did he correct his wayward children? We're not sure of this. However, human nature can show us that the sort of thing between brothers was nothing new, as Jacob himself encountered the same thing with his brother Esau. The only difference is he thought his family was safe, as his children were born under the law of God, through a loving family of two sisters. who were of the same bloodline. His brother Esau, well, his lineage was questionable. Esau was born first, but he was born so different than Jacob. His outward appearance showed that he was not a godly man at heart. So it's easy to see that Jacob never assumed that his sons were ungodly at heart. Now, no one knows the backstory of Esau, how he came to have such a hairy disposition all over his body. Could be that Esau was conceived in a very unique way. But I'll leave the controversial bit out of this video. All we need to know is that God hated Esau before he was even born. Esau was Jacob's twin brother and born first. Esau legally had first dibs on the father's inheritance. Esau and Jacob's mother could see the problem, just like Sarah saw the problem with Hagar and Ishmael. Jacob's mother had the eyes and wisdom to see the things that these boys could not. Esau had favor because not of who he was, but the position of his sonship. For this reason, the woman of sensibility and reason had to step in. Jacob was guided in his heart, and with his mother's leadership, he did what needed to be done. Jacob acted on this principle to be as innocent as the dove and shrewd as a snake. If Jacob did not act according to his mother's wishes to preserve his birthright, Esau would have squandered all of Israel's wares, and God's chosen people would have been left helpless. Now, the Bible is full of stories of this sort of thing. King Solomon loved women outside of his Hebraic faith, and what happened? He did not turn these women and children away like Abraham turned Hagar and Ishmael away. No, instead, he embraced their religion and pagan practices. So tracing the genealogy of Solomon back to King David, we are shown that, okay, King David, he had a lot going for him, and the Bible says that there was that one time he transgressed against God. Well, I'm trying to show you that the pattern of human nature keeps repeating itself. David had a daughter who was raped by her evil stepbrother. Absalom lusted after Tamar, and once he had sex with her, he hated her, abhorred her even, and David did nothing. Why are we shown that these men favor the firstborn son, even though the firstborn son isn't worthy of their father's inheritance? What's going on? Give me a minute. It's getting really interesting when we dig deep into biblical historical stories and studies, isn't it? So here we have the poor girl Tamar. She is raped and now has to live like a widow for the rest of her life because the one that raped her abhorred her and dismissed her. And we are shown that David did nothing. The king did not come to his little girl's aid. Why? Well, I guess you can ask David when you see him up in heaven, but the Bible does tell us in not so many words. Tamar's other brother stepped in and defended her honor when King David would not. Did the king have something in his heart that was against women? Why would he not defend his little girl? Well, that we do not know, but we do know that King David transgressed against God that one time. And because of that one time, King David couldn't bear to lose any more sons. That's the problem. So the sins of the father repeat themselves. King Solomon was a man who was initially loved by God. However, we can understand now through what happened between David and Bathsheba, King Solomon's mother, we can understand why King Solomon embraced other women. Bathsheba may have had a role to play in why King Solomon lost his crown. Before Solomon was born, King David took another man's wife, Bathsheba. The king set his eyes on her when he should have turned his eyes away. Oh. And this scenario is seen through the teachings of Jesus, through the study of adultery. When King David set his eyes on Bathsheba, he didn't turn his eyes or close his eyes. He did not turn and walk away. Instead, he kept gazing on her, and he used his eyes to lust after her. He committed adultery with her with his eyes. He then acted upon what his heart felt for her. He took Bathsheba into his bedchamber. She conceived a child, and to cover up her pregnancy, David placed her husband on the front lines of battle to which he did not come home a victor. Uriah died on the battlefield. King David then took Bathsheba as his wife, and when she gave birth to their child, the child soon died. Even though David fasted and repented for this death, could it be that he resented Bathsheba? Afterwards, did he put the blame on her? Well, if she wasn't bathing at night, then I wouldn't have gazed my eyes upon her, and I wouldn't have taken her for my wife. We don't know if they loved each other during the time of their marriage. We don't know if this was a happy marriage or a estranged marriage. Now, it could also be that because Bathsheba was taken by David unnaturally, it could be that she also resented him. Did she resent the children that followed? Was she in love with David, or did she hold bitterness in her heart because God took her firstborn, a child she should have had with her first husband, a man she knowingly, willingly loved and was willingly committed to? Because she loved Uriah. She didn't love King David as a man. She loved the king as her king. Perhaps now we can understand the sins of the father does follow suit to the children. And now we can understand why Solomon took so many wives. He was looking for love in all the wrong places because he was missing the love of his mother. Maybe he was missing the love of his dad too. We can be sure through human nature, King Solomon was looking for a love that he just never could have. So when Solomon became king, he married women outside of the tribes of Israel. He kept those women and children close to him and did not turn them away from him like Abraham had done. Instead, the pagan influence came into the tribe of Israel instead of the godly influence going out into the pagan tribes, as it had happened with Ishmael and Joseph. It is interesting to note that Solomon's first wife was the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh. If he turned her away, she too would have went back to her homeland, taking godly influence with her, just like Hagar and Ishmael. Instead, Solomon built her a royal palace outside of the city of David. She was to live outside of Jerusalem's borders, signifying that she did not conform to the Hebrew way. She remained true to her God and her king of Egypt. So to sum this all up, we are shown how Ishmael and Hagar went back into Egypt, taking godly influence with them. Jacob lost his son Joseph, and he too was sold into Egypt, taking godly influence with him. Moses was also someone who was raised in an Egyptian household, who had a bit of godly influence as he was nursed by his Hebrew mother. She would have taught Moses of the Hebrew God and set in his heart a love for the Hebrew God, to which would cause a searching and a yearning to know and love the Creator in very real and deliberate ways. The Bible does tell us that Moses and God were friends. I will say that they were best friends. And because of the knowledge Moses had about Egypt, He was able to expose the falsehoods and reveal that the God of creation is the ruler over everything and everyone, including the gods of Egypt. What all this backstory of biblical history has to do with us today and how it has to do with telekinesis is this. The enemy has stolen our birthright, taking back what is rightfully his, but he emancipated himself from his birthright, so now the birthright is legally ours to own. The enemy was the firstborn, and this is seen through two major players in the Bible: Ishmael, who was turned away from Abraham's inheritance, and Esau, who was tricked out of his. Oh, but this is not where the hijacking began. Oh no. It began in the Garden of God, the garden in Eden. And the enemy's child, Cain, kept his father's likeness going and going and going and going and going and going and going. Ah. Through the Bible stories that I have shared with you, I wanted to help you understand that the enemy did not acquire kingdom power on his own. He didn't invent it, and he wasn't a loving, kind, spiritual being in heaven endowed with his own power and suddenly turned on God and used his own power against God. No, the enemy was and is a created being. He was given access to kingdom power just as we are. When he was created, he was automatically given power that was woven into his being. Now let me give you an example to help you understand this a little bit better. We have been given a body, and our body has many parts. But is the eye or the hand separate from each other? Well, yes, they are, but they also work together for a greater good. Just because they can be separately used does not mean that the eye was created by God our Father and, oh, God forgot to give me a hand, so, ooh, I spontaneously generated a hand for myself. No, I came with all the working parts in me that God wanted to have for me, that God wanted me to have. My hand is separate from my eye, but my eye and my hand can work together to serve a bigger purpose and greater purpose. If I use my eyes without my hands, I am weaker than when I am if I decide to use my hand and my eyes together for a greater good. Our bodies that house our spirits are a package deal in the same way. It's up to us to know how our bodies and spirits work together or separately. And once we get in the know, we begin to utilize our persons in a way that enhances our being. This concept can be applied to the enemy. The book of Ezekiel shares with us that the enemy, the garden cherub, corrupted his wisdom, meaning he had knowledge. That knowledge and kingdom power could be used for good or evil purposes. He chose the latter. He had his benevolent power strengthened and realized as he matured. That's how you grow and mature in your faith. And he may have thought to himself, wow, if I use this power in an alternative way, wow, look at all the power I can wield over God's creation. Now this power looks so much different than the power of love. It to the enemy looked more powerful as his heart turned to hate. He inverted kingdom power, and that is why it looks so different today. Think in terms of energy. You have a positive charge in an atom, and you have a negative charge in an atom. It's the same power source, only the charge is different. Love gives God's power the positive charge, and hate gives God's power a negative charge, but it's still as powerful as the positive charge. The power of God in strength hasn't changed. It's just changed in charge and in use. So let me use a bicycle as a topic of illustration to close this up. We love our bicycles and we teach our children how to ride them at an early age, but not before they are mature enough and ready to take on that challenge. We put on their bike gear and protect them a little bit from their hard falls by putting pads on their elbows and their knees. And this is to help them should they fall. But we know that if and when they do fall, it won't be anything other than because of their riding skills. Just because they fall down, do we take the bike away and label the bike bad for scarring our children with a cut knee or a bruised elbow? Oh, no. The bike is not bad. It's an object. It is the intention of the rider that makes the experience of bike riding bad or good. Intention has a positive or a negative charge. The bike will always be a bike, neutral. No matter if it has 3 wheels, training wheels. It doesn't matter if it's a tandem bike, a unicycle, a tricycle. A bike is a vehicle meant to be pushed by its rider, who is also the driver, and that driver drives with intention, positive or negative charge. The rider can steer and crash himself or herself into a wall on purpose if they want to. Don't know why they would want to, but they can. They can crash into people or animals if they want to also. Now, if they do this on purpose, one has to question the motives, the positive or negative charge that is held in the heart and mind of the bike rider, because the bike is not bad. That person is not yet responsible to ride that bike, and they should not be riding that bike if they're crashing into people and animals and hurting themselves and hurting others with their bike. The person does not yet see the value of what it's like to enjoy bike riding in a responsible way. They are using their motive and a negative charge and using it in a negative way, harmful motives. This is why things should be taken from us, and they are. God takes away the things he gives us because we misuse them, or he allows people to continue to misuse them on purpose, to keep those who refuse to listen to God's word from obeying God's word because they are not yet ready to become responsible citizens of heaven. Just think about it. Heaven is not filled with wayward children doing whatever they want. Would you want your household run by a child who does not know how to pay the bills, who does not know how to cook dinner, who does not know how to go and run errands, who does not know how to turn on a light switch, who does not know how to turn on a carburetor, who does not know how to vacuum and keep a clean house? Do you want your household being run by immature children? Certainly not. So the kingdom of heaven is not run that way also. There is order, not chaos in the kingdom of heaven. And the enemy unfortunately picked up the tools of heaven, and with his intent, his negative intent that holds a negative charge, is wielding a weapon of power against us. But in order to do this, he needed to know how this weapon was used by us in a benevolent way. Going back to antiquity, we see the followers of God used faith in God to move mountains, to bring rain in times of drought. Hagar and Ishmael would have witnessed the relationship Abraham had with God of the heavens. They would have shared in the secret things they witnessed. They would have witnessed miracles. Joseph may have shared in the secrets unknowingly with others, including the Egyptians, not realizing that he was doing anything wrong by throwing his pearl before swine. But having godly influence incorporated into pagan practice sure makes for a more appealing religion and softens the dividing line of sense and sensibility. Having the Egyptian pagan worship incorporate some sort of godly teaching gave this pagan practice a sense of it being okay to outsiders, because Israel could see a form of godliness, they perhaps were more easily swayed into believing that it was okay to follow the ways of the Egyptian when they went to live with Joseph in Egypt. When the 11 tribes of Israel were reunited with their lost brother, they lived with Joseph in Egypt in a state of peace. They lived for a long time in that peace with Egypt, until the Pharaoh Joseph had known died. Then things took a turn for the worse. So understanding all this hidden biblical underpinning, we can now see how the enemy has used God's power as an abusive power against us today and why. The enemy has tricked us out of our inheritance, just as Jacob tricked Esau out of his inheritance. And the enemy uses kingdom power for ill-gotten gain and against us to keep us living in a state of fear. When we fear something, we stay away from it. Again, the enemy has turned positive kingdom power into negative power of this world. We assume it is different from God's power because it looks different. But it's only different because of the charge. The charge has been altered. We don't ask questions. We do not become curious out of fear. Now, I'd like you to think about this for a moment. Knowing this, how do you think the enemy would be able to do this so easily? Just as Ishmael and Hagar were able to bring back to Egypt what they had learned living in godly territory from Abraham's faith, they perhaps incorporated this teaching into their Egyptian terms of worship. This effectively created truths within lies and helped to desensitize the Israelite clans that moved into Egypt to be close to Joseph. There may have been a form of godliness that Jacob and his sons would have known, as Joseph may have recognized some truths within Egyptian worship that could be traced back to Abraham through Ishmael and Hagar. Do we not see the same truths wrapped up in lies today as Egyptian deity worship continues right in front of our faces and our TV screens? So let's jump up in the biblical timeline to a time of King Solomon once again. When King Solomon died, Israel became divided. The house of God became split, and it wasn't an even split. 2 houses of Israel against the remaining 10. How this happened was because King Solomon's heart was divided. He sold Israel out for his own ill-gotten gain. He corrupted his wisdom, used his wealth to serve himself, and forsook Israel and the future of all future clansmen. Thanks, slow-mo. The death of Solomon caught the attention of Egypt. Solomon's first wife was an Egyptian, and Solomon, like Moses, was trained in the Egyptian arts. The Egyptian pharaoh swept in and cleaned Israel's house. Then it was time for the Assyrians to sack Jerusalem, then the Persians, and then finally the Babylonians. The Egyptian gained Israel's best, but the Babylons picked up the scraps, and like a vulture, she swooped in and left barely anything for anyone else to pick from. The Israelites were overpowered by the surrounding superpowers because they were incorporating Canaanite practice, as the book of Jeremiah shows us, that the priests were at best involved in ancient secret pagan practices inside the temple walls. I believe through the visions given to Jeremiah that the priests were inscribing on the walls of things of a forbidden nature. Things that most likely were reminiscent of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Remember earlier on in this video, I asked the question of how it appeared that some of Christ's teachings can be found through the adoption of other cultures. How is it that Eastern religions teach a form of charity and benevolence that can be found in the teachings of Christ? Has anybody ever asked the question, how is it that the Egyptian Ark looks very similar to the Hebrew Ark of the Covenant? This may be why. Now, I just spent some time giving you a backstory to the answers of all these questions. The backstory is that Israel was lenient towards Canaanite clans because of their affiliations with Egypt. If it were not for the impatience of Sarah, Abraham would not have conceived Ishmael and would not have been forced to turn an Egyptian child away. If it were not for the sins of Jacob's children, Joseph would not have been sold into Egyptian slavery. So lies do not just rest with you and the person you're telling them to. They affect everybody who is eventually involved. Now, because of these two major events, Jacob's children selling Joseph and Abraham turning Hagar and Ishmael away, it is easier to see how Israel was able to relate to Egyptian teachings and become slaves to Egyptian rule. Is this why Solomon's first wife was an Egyptian? Could he see some teachings in the Egyptian pagan practice that were similar to Israelites' priesthood? Now, this information is important because it shares with us how the enemy has been able to infiltrate and use kingdom power for his gain. The enemy does not have his own set of malevolent power that he uses against us. The enemy has used kingdom power and needed godly teaching so that it could be corrupted and turned on godly people like you and myself. This keeps us living in a state of fear. Well, it's time to fear no more. The enemy does not have supernatural power of his own. The enemy uses corrupted godly power. That's what I'm trying to show you with the backstory of this biblical insight. The enemy is tapping into their inheritance just like we are, but we are listening to the enemy, believing that we have no power. We believe that all the power that the enemy uses is from the enemy and has nothing to do with God. The enemy uses God's power against us. When we understand this, the enemy loses all malevolent, influential power over us because we now know that we can tap into the same power that he has, and his power becomes null and void. He takes what is freely given and corrupts with a negative charge, and we take what is freely given and we bless with a positive charge. When we live in kingdom power with a positive charge, what happens? Jesus says, resist the devil and he will flee. Living a repentant lifestyle is our armor. It repels the negative charge of the enemy as we live in positive charge. We become like a magnet's magnetic field, repelling the force that is opposite to us. The enemy has corrupted godly power, but we know that love is more powerful than anything the enemy can provide. The enemy provides hate through the abuse of God's power. But when we provide love through the respect of God's power, suddenly the enemy has no more power to wield. Bam! That's a truth bomb the enemy never saw coming. Thank you, Jesus. I am hoping this video will help you understand the value of new scientific discovery. What science calls energy, God calls spirit, and we are spiritual creatures convinced we are bound by the laws of biology and time. Once we begin to understand how the enemy has watered down the truth, the lies we have been led to believe as truths will slowly begin to reveal themselves. One of these lies that we have been told is that the enemy is powerful in his own right. He is, but his power is not his own. It is borrowed kingdom power. Just as we are allowed to borrow kingdom power, the backstory of biblical insight was meant to help you understand that the enemy has taken God's secret things and used them against us long ago. And this has not changed. He has hijacked kingdom power back then, and he continues to do it today. To keep himself in power, he has lost his rightful position long ago when he turned his heart away from God. If it's not broke, why fix it, right? Well, the enemy is just taking back his inheritance. An inheritance he has no jurisdiction to hold. However, he lost his inheritance when he turned against God. The inheritance of kingdom power is now ours, as it always has been. The cross of Christ, as the Bible shares with us, took back kingdom control from the enemy and gave it to us, as Jesus told us. He gave us the keys to the kingdom. The beginning of wisdom is knowledge, and once you get in the know, you cannot unknow what you know. The enemy has used our sympathy and love and empathy against us, but through this video, I'm hopeful you now know that the more you know, the more empowered you become. We are no longer the enemy's victim. We are only his victims because we choose to be through ignorance, and ignorance is never bliss. God's people perish for a lack of knowledge. It's time to get in the know, to start using kingdom power for God's gain, to serve, protect, and defend. Thank you for listening. If you have questions and comments or suggestions about this video, please contact me at srnityblu@gmail.com. Please give this video a like, share it, and subscribe to this channel. Your support is so appreciated. My name is Shannon Gilmore. Thanks for watching. Be blessed.